The blood had not yet dried on the marble floors of Igi when the city erupted into whispers. King Philip II, master strategist, builder of empire, and unifier of Greece, lay dead, struck down not in battle, but by an assassin's blade during his daughter's wedding procession. The Macedonian court was stunned. Grief twisted into suspicion with unnatural speed. 17-year-old Alexander, cloaked in royal purple and shadowed eyes, stood over his father's body in silence. He was no stranger to power, but this was a throne earned through blood, not passed in peace, and already the crown felt cursed. The official version spread quickly. Pausanias, a disgruntled bodyguard, had acted out a personal vengeance. But behind the public mourning, rumors slithered through the halls like vipers. Some said the Persians had orchestrated it, hoping to destabilize Macedon before war. Others whispered of deeper, darker intentions. All eyes eventually turned to Olympias, the king's estranged queen and Alexander's mother, fierce, foreign, and feared. She had always despised Philip's other wives, especially the younger Eurydice, whom he had recently married with dynastic ambitions. Olympias returned to the palace not in grief, but in veiled triumph. Her son was king now, and none could challenge him. In the days that followed, Olympias moved quickly, executing Eurydice's family and burning letters that might have exposed her plots. Behind closed doors, she told Alexander that it was destiny that cleared his path, but his eyes betrayed unease. Had she protected him or used him? As the funeral pyres burned, Alexander ascended the throne, not with joy, but with clenched fists and a warrior's resolve. The nobles murmured prayers for unity, but many wondered, could a boy raised on tales of Achilles lead them against Persia? Or was he merely a pawn in his mother's game? One general muttered to another over wine, "A sword took the king, but it may be the queen who drew it." And far away across the sea, Darius III of Persia heard of Philip's death and smiled. The boy king did not wait to mourn. His enemies would not. Within weeks of Philip's funeral, fires ignited across Greece. Thebes rebelled, believing Macedon had lost its spine. Athens sent envoys, emboldened by Alexander's youth. Sparta watched from the shadows, sharpening blades. But Alexander was not his father. He was something new. He rode south like a storm, his elite companion cavalry thundering beside him, faces still lined with grief, eyes burning with fury. At Thermopylae he paused, where Leonidas once stood against Persia. "Let the world remember," he declared to his men, "that the blood of heroes still runs through Macedon." When Thebes refused his demands, Alexander unleashed his rage. In days the city fell, its walls crumbled, its streets ran red. Over 6,000 were slaughtered. The rest were sold into slavery. Even hardened generals looked away as children screamed. Only the house of the poet Pindar was spared, Alexander's twisted tribute to culture amid carnage. To the Greek world, it was a message written in blood. Alexander is not a boy. He is a god of war, but not all hearts rallied behind him. Among the campfires of victory, whispers began. Hephaestion, his closest companion, remained loyal, but others were shaken. Some questioned whether such brutality was strength or madness. Chief among the uneasy was Ptolemy, once a brother in arms, now a silent observer of Alexander's changing eyes. And in the shadows of the Macedonian court, a childhood friend named Harpalus made contact with a Persian emissary in secret. A coded message was passed, offering maps, troop routes, and insights into Alexander's mind, all in exchange for gold and a promise of sanctuary should things turn. Bonds forged in youth were now brittle. Oaths sworn under Philip were breaking, and Alexander, high on triumph, did not yet see the cracks forming beneath his feet. In the smoky aftermath of Thebes, he turned his gaze eastward, toward Persia, toward vengeance, toward immortality. But behind him, the first seeds of betrayal had already been sown. The fires of Thebes were still smoldering when Alexander turned his eyes to the east. But before launching his campaign against Persia, he made an unexpected detour into the heart of the desert. Not for conquest, not for diplomacy, but for something far stranger: revelation. He sought the oracle of Amun at Siwa, far beyond the Nile, in the blinding heat of the Libyan desert. Why? His advisors didn't understand. His soldiers grumbled, but Alexander pressed on, driven by a hunger greater than power, a need to know he was destined to rule not as a man, but as something more. The journey nearly killed them. The sun scorched their backs. Sandstorms swallowed their footprints. Their guides became lost and supplies dwindled. Many believed they would die in the dunes, forgotten by history before their war even began. But then, miraculously, they arrived. Some claimed serpents led the way. Others whispered of voices in the wind calling Alexander forward. The temple of Siwa rose from the sands like a mirage, ancient and eerie. Inside, the priests prepared for the young king. They had been waiting. Alexander entered the holy chamber alone. What was said inside remains one of history's great mysteries. But when he emerged, his face had changed. His eyes no longer searched for approval. They demanded obedience. He told no one what the oracle said, but word leaked. The priests had called him son of Zeus Ammon, a demigod, divine, a being beyond mortal fate. His men were stunned. Some knelt, others hesitated. But far from the desert, in the darkened halls of Pella, Olympia smiled. It had worked. Years ago, she had quietly bribed the priests of Siwa, planting seeds for this very moment, knowing her son would one day seek proof of his greatness. She believed in his destiny, but also knew destiny could be manipulated. Alexander never discovered the truth. He returned to his army reborn, not just as king of Macedon, but as a god-king chosen to conquer east and west. He abandoned the simplicity of mortal ambition. From now on, his war would not be against Darius alone, but against limits, history, and death itself. And so began the transformation, not just of Alexander the man, but of Alexander the myth. The river Granicus was the first true test of Alexander's mettle as a king. The Persian Empire, ancient and vast, stretched out before him like an endless sea of armies and ambition. The battle would set the tone for everything to come. Victory would solidify his claim as the rightful heir to Philip's throne, but defeat would spell disaster for his dreams of conquest. His men, seasoned by smaller skirmishes, but not the full force of Persian retaliation, were uneasy. Many feared they were marching into the jaws of a trap, and it was a trap, but not one they expected. The Persian forces lay hidden on the opposite bank of the river, positioned in a way that would make a frontal assault seem suicidal. The Persian general, Arsides, was a tactician known for his brutal precision. He had arranged his forces to take advantage of the Granicus's strong current, using the river itself as a natural barrier and expecting the Macedonian forces to hesitate in crossing. But Alexander did not hesitate. With his eyes locked on the enemy, he made a choice that would mark him forever as a leader who defied convention. With no cavalry reserve, no reinforced defenses, and no promise of success, Alexander led the charge across the Granicus River. In the face of overwhelming odds, he plunged into the fast-moving water himself, his horse pushing against the current. The army followed, as if driven by something more than mere orders. They were carried by his unshakable belief in destiny, a belief that was rapidly becoming their own. The Persians were not prepared for this headlong, suicidal charge. Aristes underestimated the ferocity of the Macedonian assault, especially from their legendary companion cavalry. The river, which was meant to be an obstacle, became a weapon in Alexander's hands, breaking the lines of the Persian defense. The battle erupted into chaos. The Persians, expecting Alexander to hesitate, faltered under the relentless advance of his men, whose courage was fed by their leader's own boldness. The clash was brutal. Alexander's horse was struck twice with spears, yet he rode forward as if untouched, a figure of unstoppable wrath. His sword cleaved through Persian armor, and his eyes, wide with determination, burned with the fire of a man who knew only victory. But the true test came when Aristes himself appeared, riding in full armor, flanked by his elite guard. It was then that Alexander's courage faltered not an inch, but his strategy did. In the heat of the battle, his generals cautioned him to stay back, to let his cavalry deal with the final charge. But Alexander, drunk on the thrill of war, would not relent. In a single reckless move, he dashed towards Aristes, aiming for his throat. At that moment, a general loyal to Alexander, Parmenion, made a fateful decision. Knowing the king's charge was far too dangerous, he sent a small group of cavalry to intercept. Orestes was slain in the melee, but Alexander was nearly overwhelmed. It was only through the quick action of his trusted generals that he was pulled from the fray. The Persian forces broke. The Macedonians swept through, and the day was won, but not without consequences. Alexander was left bruised, his armor dented, and his resolve shaken. He had nearly paid the price for his arrogance, and in that moment, the reality of leadership hit him. A king could not always lead from the front. He had to lead from the mind. Doubt flickered. However, the victory at Granicus was a victory of immense importance, symbolic and strategic. Not only did it shatter the illusion of Persian invincibility, but it also sent a clear message to the world. Alexander's will could not be broken. His men, though shocked by his near death, were in awe of his bravery. But as the army celebrated the conquest, a cold truth settled among the ranks. Alexander had come perilously close to losing everything. And somewhere in the distance, Darius III watched, his eyes narrowed, realizing that the real danger had only just begun. The world held its breath as the armies of Alexander and Darius III finally clashed in the narrow coastal plains of Issus, a place destined to become legend. The Persian king, commanding an army several times the size of the Macedonian force, had every advantage: numbers, terrain, wealth, and the pride of an empire behind him. And yet he fled. In the chaos of battle, Alexander pierced the Persian center with surgical precision, driving straight toward Darius, who at the sight of the Macedonian king barreling toward him like a living thunderbolt, abandoned the field, leaving behind not only treasure, but his wife, mother, and daughters. Victory was total. The impossible had happened again. But Alexander didn't see triumph in Darius's flight. He saw insult. The king he had longed to face man to man had run from him. The moment that should have sealed his glory instead left him hollow, his sword unsated. In the Persian royal tent, the mood shifted. Darius's family, now Alexander's prisoners, braced for death or dishonor. But Alexander, to everyone's shock, treated them with dignity. He allowed the queen mother to retain her title. He bowed respectfully to Darius's wife. When her beauty was praised by his generals, Alexander cut them off coldly. She is still a queen, but that noble facade masked a storm beneath. Alexander began to visit her tent, often and alone. At first it was diplomacy, then curiosity, then something else. She was intelligent, articulate, and fiercely proud, unlike any woman he'd known. She spoke to him not as a prisoner or a subject, but as an equal, and something dangerous sparked between them. His court noticed. Hephaestion, Alexander's dearest companion, said nothing, but his silence became deafening. Ptolemy, always pragmatic, warned that the army's loyalty was fraying. Macedonian nobles whispered in the shadows, watching their king become entranced by the wife of their sworn enemy. To them it wasn't love, it was treason wrapped in silk. In secret, a faction began to form. Disillusioned by Alexander's actions, they questioned whether his heart still belonged to Macedon or had been seduced by Persia. Worse still, the identity of the traitor who'd contacted Persia after Thebes remained unknown. Now, with new alliances forming behind closed doors and Alexander distracted by forbidden desires, that old betrayal took on new urgency. Meanwhile, Darius sent a peace offer. Lands west of the Euphrates, gold beyond imagining, and his daughter's hand in marriage. The same woman Alexander was already growing dangerously close to. The offer would have made Alexander ruler of half the known world. He refused without hesitation. His eyes turned east. There can be no two suns in the sky, he told his generals, and no two kings on the earth. The march deeper into Persia would continue. But behind him, love, loyalty, and old friendships were starting to rot. And no empire, not even his, could stand forever on cracked foundations. Tyre, a wealthy island fortress off the coast of Phoenicia, was the next obstacle in Alexander's march east, and it would become his most brutal challenge yet. A city of seafarers and merchants, its walls were legendary, its defenses impenetrable, and its people fiercely independent. When Alexander demanded entry to offer sacrifice at their temple of Heracles, the Tyrians sent a cold reply. You may offer sacrifice when you are king of Asia. War was declared. But Tyre wasn't like the cities before. It didn't fall with a single charge or surrender after a stunning cavalry maneuver. It defied Alexander for 7 long months. The city, half a mile offshore, dared him to reach it. The sea itself became a battlefield. So Alexander did the impossible. He built a causeway, stone by stone, dragging rubble from the mainland and piling it into the sea. Every day the Tyrians rained down arrows, fire, and scorn. Every night Macedonian corpses were dragged from the waves. Yet the land bridge grew, supplies ran low, morale dipped, disease took hold. Men began to curse the gods. Some believed Tyre was cursed, that Alexander's ambition had finally overreached. And then came the leak. The Tyrians anticipated a key maneuver, a feigned retreat designed to draw their navy into a trap. But somehow they knew the plan before it happened. The trap collapsed. Macedonian losses were heavy. The sea turned red. Alexander's fury was volcanic. He summoned his inner circle. "We are betrayed," he hissed, "not by our enemies, by one of our own." Suspicion rippled through the camp. Eyes shifted. Trust frayed. But the traitor remained hidden. Meanwhile, the advisor who had proposed the retreat went missing, found days later floating face down in a wine barrel. Officially, suicide. Unofficially, silenced. Then came a gift from an unexpected source. A Phoenician sailor, captured in a skirmish, offered a chilling revelation. A senior Macedonian advisor, one of Alexander's oldest confidants, had taken Tyrian gold. Not out of greed, but doubt. He believed Alexander's war was madness and had tried to end it quietly. His name was Eumenes, the same man who once toasted Alexander as a brother. Alexander didn't speak when the confession was confirmed. He simply nodded. That night, Eumenes vanished from his tent. His body was never found. After the betrayal, Alexander grew colder. He ordered a new assault with unparalleled ferocity. Siege towers, catapults, fire ships. The once defiant Tyrian navy was crushed by a fleet Alexander had assembled from conquered Phoenician ports. The causeway reached the walls, and Alexander himself led the final charge. Tyre burned. Thousands were slaughtered. Survivors were crucified along the shoreline. It was no longer just a siege. It was a message to the world. No wall, no sea, no god would stop him. But even in victory, the toll was clear. The king who once spared royal families and wept for lost scrolls had now become something colder, sharper. A man for whom betrayal no longer surprised, only confirmed what he had begun to suspect. That shadows walked beside him. Always after the bloodshed at Tyre, Egypt greeted Alexander not with swords, but with open arms. The Persian satraps had long oppressed the land of the Nile. To the Egyptians, Alexander was not a conqueror. He was a liberator, a foreigner who brought with him not chains, but hope. As he entered Memphis, crowds thronged the streets, chanting praises and tossing flowers. Priests proclaimed him Pharaoh, the living son of Amun-Ra. And for a moment, just a moment, Alexander felt peace. In that fertile land of river gods and golden tombs, he began to dream of more than conquest. He envisioned a city to unite his worlds, a beacon between East and West. He called it Alexandria. But even amidst triumph, fate wove a darker thread. At a temple in Siwa, as he received a second divine confirmation of his lineage, the oracle of Ammon declaring him not merely a king, but a god incarnate. He met her, Tyre, a priestess cloaked in white linen and mystery. Her eyes were amber fire, her voice smoke. She spoke in riddles. She moved like prophecy. To Alexander, she was unlike any woman he had known. Not a captive queen or a noble pawn. She was elemental, as if the desert had birthed her from sand and flame. And he fell. Night after night she came to him, speaking of ancient secrets, forgotten kings and the gods that walked before time. She whispered that he was more than mortal, that he was destined to rule eternity. She kissed him with lips that tasted like fate. But Tyre was no priestess. She was a Persian spy, trained since girlhood by Darius's inner circle to seduce, deceive, and, if needed, kill. Her mission had only one goal: poison the king. It was not a blade or a goblet she used, but something slower, crueler, a rare venom Diluted and hidden in oils she massaged into his skin, in incense he breathed while he slept. It would not kill him outright. It would weaken him, cloud his mind, dull his judgment, turn the god king into a vulnerable man. And it worked. Alexander's temper frayed. He began to hallucinate, waking in a sweat, crying out for Darius, for his father, for shadows only he could see. His generals whispered. Hephaestion begged him to rest. Ptolemy urged him to leave Egypt and march east before rot set in. But Alexander remained. Trapped in Tyset's spell, he built temples and spoke to stars. He declared new gods and began drafting laws in languages he didn't understand. It was Hephaestion, ever watchful, who uncovered the truth. He intercepted a message written in Old Persian, a report addressed to Babylon, hidden in Tyset's chamber. He confronted Alexander in private. At first the king raged, accused him of jealousy, madness, treason. But in time the fever lifted, and he saw the truth. Tyset was gone, disappeared into the night with no trace. Some said she returned to Persia. Others claimed she was never real at all, a vision conjured by the gods to test him. Alexander left Egypt changed, harder, colder. Whatever part of him had longed for peace died on that golden shore. In its place stood something new. Not a man, not a king, but a force of destiny, purged by betrayal, untouchable and unmerciful. And so he turned his eyes back east, toward Darius, toward Persia, toward the empire he had sworn to consume. But the poison, though banished, was not gone. The Nile was behind him, but Egypt never left Alexander. It followed him in the way he walked, straighter, slower, like one accustomed to being worshipped. It lingered in the golden trim of his armor, in the sacred rituals he now observed each morning. And most of all, it pulsed in the whisper he could not silence. You are not a man. You are a god. After the conquest of Egypt and the founding of Alexandria, Alexander's march east resumed with fresh zeal. But something had changed. He no longer saw himself as a mortal king avenging his father. Now he believed he had a divine destiny to unite East and West, not as a ruler of men, but as a bridge between worlds. To cement his rule, he began to adopt Persian customs. He wore the diadem and robes of a Persian Shah, grew his beard in the old royal style, and even insisted on proskynesis, the traditional bow of submission to a god king. To the Persians, it was brilliance. To the Macedonians, it was blasphemy. At his war councils, Alexander sat on an elevated golden throne. His generals, the same men who had bled with him since boyhood, were expected to bow and avert their gaze. Ptolemy refused. So did Antipater. Even Hephaestion hesitated. Only Cletus, the man who once saved Alexander's life at Granicus, dared say aloud what others only whispered. You were born of a mortal womb, not fire or lightning. You bleed like the rest of us. Alexander said nothing, but his eyes burned colder each day. Behind closed doors, a circle of conspirators began to grow. Senior officers, Macedonian nobles, even scribes, men who had once laughed around campfires now huddled in silence, asking the same question. Had their king lost himself in the myths he had created? Meanwhile, Alexander sought new legitimacy through blood and ritual. He conducted secret rites in Babylonian temples. He invoked Egyptian gods during Persian festivals. He claimed divine lineage not just from Zeus, but from Amun-Ra, Mithra, and Ahura Mazda. He was building something no one could understand, an empire not of territory but of belief. But the more he embraced the divine, the more isolated he became. His conversations grew philosophical, abstract. He spoke of time as a spiral, of rebirth, of universal order. His eyes looked east, but his thoughts drifted skyward. His soldiers whispered behind tents. His commanders exchanged glances during feasts. Some called him visionary, others mad. Then came the final fracture. Alexander began commissioning statues of himself, not as king, but as living deity, crowned in sun rays, feet hovering above the earth, thunderbolt in hand. One was placed beside the image of Zeus himself in a shrine. That night, a marble bust of Alexander was found defaced, the nose broken, the crown shattered. The culprit was never caught, but Alexander's rage was terrifying. He ordered the immediate execution of 3 guards, then doubled the number of informants in the camp. The siege to unite the world had become a war within his own court, and yet, despite the paranoia, the fear, the whispers, his march pressed on. Because whether he was God or man, tyrant or Messiah, Alexander believed one thing above all: you cannot build a new world if you remain bound to the old one. And so, with fire in his heart and shadows at his back, the self-proclaimed King of Two Worlds marched toward the final reckoning, where only one could survive: the king or the man. It began beneath a black moon. On the wide open plains of Gaugamela, Darius III gathered the full weight of the Persian Empire. More than 200,000 troops, war elephants, chariots armed with scythes, and warriors drawn from the corners of a realm stretching from the Mediterranean to the Hindu Kush. This was no border skirmish, no siege or coastal rebellion. This was the reckoning. Alexander, outnumbered 4-1, had chosen his battlefield carefully. Flat terrain meant speed could triumph over numbers. But even the boldest of his generals, Parmenion, Hephaestion, Ptolemy, urged caution. Some begged for delay, others feared annihilation. But Alexander smiled. "This is not a battle," he said. "This is the moment history holds its breath." He spent the night pacing his tent alone, sword untouched, eyes locked on the horizon. He didn't sleep. He barely blinked. In the hours before dawn, he told his closest companions that he would either be king of the world or food for the crows. And then he rode into legend. The Dance of Death. As dawn broke, Darius's forces stretched across the plain like an iron sea. His golden chariot gleamed at the center, surrounded by the immortals, elite Persian guards in robes of black and silver. At his side, the captive family he had once lost at Issus, now restored to him, watching in fear. Alexander led with a cavalry feint, drawing Persian chariots to one side. His lines flexed, bent, teased the enemy into overextending. The Persians surged, sure of victory. But then, Alexander broke the center. With pinpoint timing, he led his companion cavalry like a thunderbolt through a gap in the Persian line. Dust filled the air. Blades flashed. Darius's personal guard collapsed in chaos. Darius fled. Again. For the second time, the King of Kings turned his chariot and vanished into the smoke, abandoning his throne, his men, and the last hope of the empire. Victory belonged to Alexander. The field was littered with corpses. The river ran red. But for the first time, his triumph felt hollow. The twist. A ghost victory. Alexander did not celebrate. He did not drink. He did not raise his sword. Because when he entered Darius's command tent, the great golden canopy from which the empire had once been ruled, he found it empty. The throne overturned. The standard trampled. No sign of Darius. "He was never here," Alexander whispered. "Only his shadow." He was right. Darius had planned for defeat. The Persian court had already fled east toward Bactria, and in secret a cabal of Persian nobles, led by the ambitious Bessus, began plotting to betray Darius, to offer his corpse to Alexander as a peace gift. Alexander did not want a gift. He wanted a rival. He wanted justice, a final, glorious duel to end the ancient feud. Instead, he inherited a ghost. When word came days later that Darius had been murdered by his own men, Alexander collapsed to his knees. "I did not cross the world to kill a fugitive," he said, staring into the fire. "I came to defeat a king." In an act that stunned the world, Alexander ordered a royal funeral for Darius, draped his body in silks, buried him with honors in the tombs of Persian kings. To the Persians, it was blasphemy, but also salvation. In mourning their king, they accepted a new one. But to Alexander's own men, it was something else entirely, a sign that their leader, once so grounded in vengeance and glory, was now chasing something they could no longer understand. Gaugamela was not just a battle. It was the end of one empire, and the moment Alexander stopped being mortal. He had defeated the greatest power in the known world. Now the only enemy left was time. Persepolis, the heart of the Persian soul. A city built not for war, but for wonder, carved into the side of sacred mountains, with towering columns like forests of marble, and walls etched with the stories of empires long before Alexander's birth. When he arrived, the city did not resist. The Persian nobles had fled or bowed. The priests made offerings. The gates opened without a fight. Victory for once came not in blood, but silence. Alexander entered Persepolis as a liberator and as its destroyer. The crownless throne. As he stood in the Hall of 100 Columns, once the ceremonial throne room of Darius and Xerxes, Alexander felt the weight of conquest pressing against his shoulders. Here was the seat of the empire that had threatened Greece for centuries. Here was the palace that funded the Persian invasion of his homeland, the empire that once dared challenge Athens, burn temples, crucify rebels. And now, he owned it all. But was it enough? His companions drank. His generals laughed. His soldiers took spoils, gold, jewels, silks, and slaves. But Alexander stood apart, staring at the stone throne, unmoving. He sat in it and hated how natural it felt. The inferno of regret. The fire began as a joke, or a dare, or a vendetta. Historians would argue for centuries, but one name appears in every version of the story. Thais, a beautiful, sharp-tongued Athenian courtesan and companion to Ptolemy. She stood at Alexander's banquet table that night, among the clinking of goblets and the echo of laughter. She raised a cup and declared, "Why not burn the palace of the kings who burned our temples in Greece? Let fire answer fire." The crowd roared. Alexander, drunk, exhausted, haunted, stood up, torch in hand, stumbling, laughing, burning with something deeper than wine. He led a torchlit parade through the halls of Persepolis, and when he reached the great palace of Xerxes, he threw the torch. Others followed. The palace burned. The twist. What was lost? By morning, the flames had consumed the soul of an empire. Entire libraries, texts in ancient tongues no Greek could yet read, were reduced to ash. Scrolls of science, medicine, poetry, astronomy, gone. When Alexander awoke, his head pounding, the sky above Persepolis was black with smoke. He wandered the scorched remains alone, sat among the cinders, held a half-burned scroll in trembling hands. He had burned what he came to preserve. "I wanted to become Achilles," he whispered, "but I may have become Xerxes." The aftermath. The fire changed everything. To the Persians, it was unforgivable desecration. To the Macedonians, it was a glimpse into their king's unraveling soul. Whispers turned into rumors, rumors into fears. Some wondered if Alexander had lost control, or worse, had done it on purpose, to erase the past and forge a new world in his image. In private, Ptolemy confronted him. "You conquered Persia, but now you burn it? What do you want from this world?" Alexander didn't answer. He just stared into the rising smoke and whispered, "Everything." That night, the ashes of Persepolis choked the stars, and Alexander, once a beacon of vision and unyielding purpose, stood not as a builder of empires, but as a man who had begun to destroy the very future he claimed to seek. The ashes of Persepolis had barely cooled when Alexander turned his gaze farther east. Persia had fallen. Darius was dead. The empire he'd sworn to conquer was his, so why did he keep marching? Many of his men believed they would return home at last. Instead, they were led into the vast and unknown east, through scorched deserts, frozen mountains, and jungles whispered to be cursed. And as the terrain grew more alien, so too did Alexander himself, into Bactria, the edge of the world. It was no longer about battles or borders. Now Alexander chased phantoms, Bessus, the usurper who betrayed Darius and declared himself king. But even after Bessus was captured and executed, Alexander did not stop. He declared a new mission, to unite East and West under one crown, one people, one God. He adopted Persian dress, took Persian wives, forced his generals to bow in Eastern fashion. He demanded not loyalty, but reverence. And one night, in a candle-lit chamber deep in the Bactrian hills, he began to speak to someone who was no longer there. The twist, a ghost in the mirror, Darius. Alexander began to dream of him, first as a whisper, then a presence, then a fully formed man standing by his bed, eyes hollow, robes soaked in blood. In these dreams, Darius did not scream. He did not curse. He only asked one question. Who do you think you are? Alexander would wake in a cold sweat, gripping his sword, staring into the dark. He confided in no one. But his men noticed changes. He spoke less, slept less, smiled never. He punished soldiers for imaginary crimes. He ordered temples to be built, and then burned their blueprints days later. He spoke of destiny as if it were a living creature stalking him. Even his most trusted general, Hephaestion, began to worry. We followed a man. Now we serve a god who bleeds in silence. Madness or metamorphosis? As Alexander plunged deeper into Central Asia, he began building cities named after himself. Alexandria this, Alexandria that, dozens of them, as if to rewrite the map in his own image. He hunted visions now more than victories. He sought oracles carved into cliffs, whispered to trees, studied ancient cults of light and fire. He carried a copy of Homer's Iliad with him at all times, reading it like scripture. He spoke of Achilles less as a hero and more as a precedent. In one feverish rant, he declared, I am not the son of Philip. I am the son of no man. I am the storm. I am the fire that cleanses the earth of its empires. His men began to speak of him not as a general, but as something else entirely, a prophet, a lunatic, a god. The haunting one night, alone in a ruined Zoroastrian temple, Alexander awoke to find the shadow of Darius seated across from him, silent, unmoving, eyes full of sorrow. I became what you were, Alexander said, voice shaking, but I did not become more. The ghost said nothing, and then it smiled. Alexander screamed and smashed his goblet against the wall. His guards rushed in, found nothing. But from that night on, Alexander began to speak less of conquest and more of escape. The conqueror consumed. The man who once laughed into the face of impossible odds now stood alone in the heart of a world he had claimed, but could no longer recognize. His men began to talk of mutiny, his generals whispered of madness, and Alexander himself, he kept riding, into storms, into darkness, into lands unmapped, chasing not glory but something far more elusive, peace. He had conquered empires, but what Alexander couldn't conquer was trust. As the campaign dragged into the wild frontiers of Asia, Alexander's men grew weary. They had marched thousands of miles, buried their brothers in foreign soil, and watched their king transform from mortal general to self-proclaimed god. And now they murmured in the shadows, whispers of rebellion, of going home, of putting an end to a madness wearing a golden crown. The breaking point. They had crossed the Hindu Kush, scaled jagged mountains that tore flesh from bone, only to face starvation, disease, and endless battles in India. And still Alexander pressed forward. When the veteran commander Cletus the Black confronted him during a feast, history turned inside out. Cletus was no ordinary soldier. He had once saved Alexander's life at the Battle of Granicus. He had known him since youth. He was family by blood and by war. But Cletus could no longer stay silent. As wine flowed and tension thickened, Cletus rose and shouted, You wear silk and jewels like a Persian prince, while your men rot in mud and your gods turn their faces. You forget who made you king. The twist. The spear of the god king. Alexander froze. The feast hall fell silent. A single torch crackled. And then Alexander hurled his spear. It struck Cletus in the heart. The man who had once shielded him with his own body now fell at his feet, dead by the hand he had sworn to protect. Silence, then gasps, then horror. Alexander staggered back, as if waking from a trance. What have I done? He whispered, voice cracking. He ran from the hall, fell to his knees in the cold, blood-soaked courtyard. For 3 days he refused food or drink, weeping alone, begging the gods or himself for forgiveness. The cracks in the divine. After Cletus's death, something changed forever. The spell broke. His men no longer saw a god. They saw a man unraveling. They had feared him, admired him, but now they pitied him. Some tried to desert. Others began sending letters home, to Macedonia, to Athens, to Sparta, asking, "What is left to fight for?" Even Hephaestion, Alexander's closest companion, could no longer reach him. Alexander spoke only to shadows. He trained alone. And in the tent where Cletus had once laughed, he kept the bloodied spear propped upright like a marker over a grave. The weight of empire. In private, Alexander confessed to a scribe, "Every empire I conquer, I lose a part of myself. First I buried my father, then my soul, and now, my brother." He no longer spoke of glory, only of silence, and yet he would not stop. He could not. There was still one river left to cross, one city left to rename, one final illusion to cling to, that the further he went, the closer he'd come to making sense of it all. In killing Cletus, Alexander didn't just murder a friend. He killed the last living piece of the man he used to be. It was meant to be a union of worlds. Instead, it became the spark of a storm. After years of conquest, Alexander stood victorious across Asia. But his victories had left the land fractured and his men divided. Greeks and Persians, conquerors and conquered, stood on opposite shores of culture, faith, and blood. And so Alexander made a choice that stunned his empire. He would marry a Persian, a queen from the mountains. Her name was Roxanna, a noblewoman of Bactria, the daughter of a fierce local lord. She was proud, intelligent, beautiful. But more than that, she was symbolic. To Alexander, Roxanna wasn't just a bride. She was a bridge, a way to unite East and West, not through war, but through love and bloodline. But to his Macedonian generals, she was a threat. "You would take a barbarian as queen?" one of them hissed. "You shame your mother, your people, and your gods." Alexander silenced him with a look, but the poison had already seeped into the court. The wedding of dissonance. The wedding was a grand display of diplomacy. Persian nobles wept in gratitude. Eastern provinces rejoiced. Even former enemies toasted the union. Roxanna, regal in ceremonial silks, bowed before Alexander, who raised her hand and declared her his equal. But behind the golden veils and wine cups, a deadly silence grew. His closest generals, Ptolemy, Cassander, and Antipater, watched with hollow eyes. They whispered in corners, traded glances that did not speak of celebration, but contingency. The twist. Blood on the wedding night. That very night, as Roxanna prepared to consummate her union with the man who conquered her world, a dagger glinted in the shadows of the bridal tent. It came not from a scorned Persian, but from within Alexander's own ranks. One of his trusted generals, unable to bear the thought of a foreign queen, had ordered her assassination, believing it was the only way to break the spell of madness, consuming their king. But Roxanna, raised among warriors, was no easy prey. She disarmed the assassin with a hairpin and slit his throat with his own blade, staining her wedding silks in crimson. When Alexander arrived moments later, she was still holding the weapon, breathless, shaking, alive. Fire in the palace. Alexander exploded in fury. He executed the conspirators' entire household, wives, children, servants, scribes, anyone who had spoken his name. He locked his generals in their quarters and declared, "From this night on, she is not just queen, she is the future." Some bent the knee, others clenched their fists. The fractures had widened. The cost of unity. In the days that followed, Alexander ordered mass marriages between his soldiers and Persian women, forcing them to wed in a single sweeping ceremony. Most obeyed, but their hearts did not. For many Macedonians, the queen was a symbol of betrayal. For many Persians, she was a symbol of surrender. And for Roxanna herself, she was trapped between two worlds that hated her for belonging to both. The queen and the conqueror. And yet love did grow, not of legend or romance, but of shared trauma, trust, and ambition. Roxanna stood beside Alexander in every campaign that followed. She learned Greek. He began studying Persian poetry. She advised him on rebellions and assassins. He entrusted her with secrets no man had heard. Together they dreamed of a future empire that no longer cared where someone came from, but who they could become. But as we know, empires built on dreams must wake eventually. The jungle was dense. The rains were endless. The glory was gone. Alexander stood deep in the heart of India, far beyond any map his advisors carried. His men, exhausted and skeletal, dragged their armor through the mud. The sun scorched by day and the monsoons drowned by night. And still he pressed forward, chasing a dream none could see but him. He spoke of oceans, of cities that would bear his name, of gods he would one day stand among. But in their eyes he had already ceased to be a man. He was myth, wrapped in bronze and blood, untouchable, unbreakable, immortal, until the day he bled. The battle at the edge of the world. In the lands of the Mallians, fierce tribes waited with poisoned arrows and war elephants. Alexander, ignoring every counsel to proceed cautiously, chose a reckless assault. "If we wait," he told his men, "they'll think I fear them." So he climbed the walls himself, sword in hand, leaping alone into the enemy citadel. For a heartbeat, the god-king stood radiant atop the fortress walls. And then, an arrow struck him in the ribs. Deep, the iron tip vanished beneath flesh. Blood poured from his side. He collapsed in silence. The moment the world stopped, his men stormed the walls too late. They found him unconscious, body limp, face pale. For days he drifted between life and death. Word spread like wildfire. Alexander is dying. Some prayed, some packed, some plotted, but most stood frozen, paralyzed by a single horrifying realization. Gods don't bleed. The crack in the myth. In those days of silence, the army unraveled. Factions formed. Commanders bickered. Rumors flew. Some said Alexander was already dead, and his advisors were hiding the truth. Others whispered that the wound was a divine punishment for his arrogance. But when he finally awoke, pale and gasping, he did not speak of victory. He asked for Hephaestion. He asked for Roxanna. He asked, terrified, if he still looked like a king. The twist, a voice in the dark. That night, as he lay recovering, a priest from Egypt arrived with a sealed scroll. It was an ancient prophecy, long hidden, said to reveal the fate of any who tried to unite the known world under one throne. Alexander read it, twice, then burned it in silence. What it said he never shared. But the next morning he summoned his men and addressed them, not as a god, not as a king, but as a soldier. "I am not immortal, but what we've built can be." He offered them a choice: continue with him to the edge of the sea, or return home with honor. For the first time they chose to turn back. The wound that never healed. The arrow was removed, but its poison lingered. Alexander recovered, mostly, but his stride was slower. His eyes were hollow. He no longer ran to the front lines. Something deeper than flesh had been pierced. He had seen his own death, and worse, he had seen how quickly the world would forget. The god had fallen, and in his place stood a man, just a man, terrified of time, of legacy, of being remembered not as a builder of worlds, but as a destroyer lost in myth. The city of Babylon was sweltering under the weight of an endless summer. The palaces, grand and gilded, stood in perfect silence. Yet within their walls a storm brewed, not of soldiers or enemies, but of truths too great to hide. Alexander, once a young king with the world at his feet, now lay broken, feverish and frail on a bed he had designed to conquer history. His body, ravaged by years of unrelenting ambition, had given way to illness. But it was something deeper, more insidious that had torn at him. He was dying, not just of fever, but of regret. The last whispers. As his body weakened, the great conqueror could no longer escape the questions that had haunted him since the first city he had razed. What had he truly wanted? Was it power? Glory? Or was there something darker in the depths of his heart, a desire to remake the world in his image, no matter the cost? And so, as he lay on the brink of death, Alexander whispered to his closest general, Perdiccas, the one man who had always been his shadow, his confidant. "To the strongest," he said, voice barely audible. The phrase had always been his battle cry, a call for survival above all. But now, in the final moments, it meant something else entirely. Perdiccas, who had always lived in Alexander's shadow, understood at once. But before he could speak, Alexander's breathing faltered, and the light of the king, the god, flickered out. The final twist. As his generals gathered to watch their king slip away, a final horrifying secret was uncovered, one that shattered everything. In the hours following Alexander's death, a letter was discovered among his personal belongings. It had been sealed, hidden from all eyes, and only opened upon his passing. The letter was addressed not to his generals or to his family, but to himself. And in it, Alexander confessed the truth that would haunt his legacy forever. I never meant to conquer the world. I did not seek to build empires or glory, but to break them, to shatter everything, to leave the old world in ruins and rebuild from the ashes something entirely new. The deception revealed. The generals stood in stunned silence. They had believed the conquest was for honor, for destiny, for immortality. But now they realized the true nature of their king's quest was not a vision of unity, but of destruction. Alexander had deceived them all. He had made them believe in the myth of a conqueror, when in truth he had set them on a path to destroy the very world they had sought to build. What he sought was not empire, but chaos. And that was the real reason for his wars, to break the world so that it could be remade, by him and only him. The legacy of ashes. In the days that followed, the empire began to fracture. The generals fought amongst themselves, unsure whether to follow the plans Alexander had laid out, or to scatter in different directions, to claim pieces of the empire for themselves. Without Alexander's vision to guide them, there was no cohesion, no unity. His empire collapsed into bickering factions. Roxanna, now a widow, mourned the man who had both loved and deceived her. She would spend the rest of her life trying to protect their son. But even he, born of Alexander's blood, would never see the world his father had dreamed of building. There was no empire to inherit, only a shattered legend. The immortal lie. As the years passed, the story of Alexander became the story of myth, a tale of a king who sought to conquer the world and rule forever. But those who knew the truth, the generals, the soldiers, the people, knew that the conqueror had not been driven by visions of greatness, but by something far darker. He had not wanted to rule the world. He had wanted to destroy it. In the end, Alexander of Macedon did not achieve immortality through conquest, but through the lies he wove. He became not a man, but a legend. The world would remember him not for what he built, but for the devastation he left behind. A king who sought to remake the world, only to watch it fall apart. The final legacy. And so, the greatest general in history, who had shattered the Persian Empire, who had crushed all who stood before him, and who had once believed himself a god, was forgotten in time. Not as a king of conquerors, but as a king of chaos. His name would echo through the ages, but not in the way he had once dreamed. For immortality is not achieved through force of arms, but through the truth that survives. And the truth was this: Alexander was not the greatest general who ever lived. He was the greatest liar the world had ever known. This is the tragic and haunting end of Alexander's story. The ambition to reshape the world gave way to a darker legacy than he had ever intended, leaving a torn empire and an immortal lie.